The merciless sun blazed overhead like a copper coin hammered flat against the bleached dome of sky, casting its punishing heat across the barren trail that stretched beyond Bitter Creek. Heat waves shimmered off the hardpan earth, distorting the horizon into liquid mirages that promised water, but delivered only dust and despair. It was July 15th, 1867, and the desert showed no mercy to man or beast foolish enough to venture into its embrace during the scorching midday hours. Eli Boone reined in his weathered bay mare Dolly as something unusual caught his eye through the dancing heat waves. A small figure moved along the distant trail, struggling with what appeared to be an enormous burden. As Eli squinted against the glare, the scene came into sharper focus. A boy, no more than 12 years old, his slight frame bent nearly double as he dragged something massive behind him. The sight struck Eli with unexpected force, sending a familiar ache through his chest. 3 years had passed since that terrible day in Dawson Creek, when his own world had shattered. The memory came flooding back with crystalline clarity. Sarah, his beloved wife, clutching their 5-year-old daughter Emma as masked gunmen, stormed through the town's main street. The acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of terrified townspeople. And then the silence, that awful eternal silence, that followed the crack of rifles. He'd been working the late shift at the mine that day, returning home to find his family among the 17 souls claimed by what the newspapers called a brazen daylight robbery. The killers had vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. Since then, Eli had wandered from town to town, job to job, carrying his sorrow like a stone in his chest. He'd tried to outrun the memories, but they followed him everywhere: the sound of a child's laughter, the sight of a woman's gentle smile, the way sunlight caught in golden hair. Each reminder was a fresh wound, keeping his loss as raw as the day it happened. Now, watching this unknown boy struggle in the blazing heat, Eli felt something stir in the hollow space where his heart used to be. The child was in obvious distress, his movements erratic and desperate. A thick rope cut into his chest, secured around his torso like a harness. And with each labored step, he hauled a massive burlap sack that scraped and bumped across the rocky ground. Spurring Dolly forward, Eli approached cautiously. The boy's condition became more apparent with each yard closed between them. His clothes hung in tatters, his bare feet were cut and bleeding, leaving dark spots on the pale earth. Deep gashes ran across his soles, where sharp stones had bitten through tender flesh, and he stopped frequently to catch his breath, his small chest heaving with exhaustion. "Sweet Jesus," Eli muttered under his breath, dismounting slowly when he was still 20 feet away. He'd learned to read desperation in all its forms during his years of drifting, and this boy radiated pure terror. The sound of hoofbeats caused the child to spin around wild-eyed and trembling. Up close, Eli could see the full extent of his injuries. Fresh bruises painted his arms in vivid purples and yellows, and a healing black eye spoke of violence, both recent and repeated. His hands, small and raw from the rope, shook uncontrollably as he clutched the line tighter to his chest. "Easy there, son." Eli said, his voice deliberately calm and measured. He kept his hands visible, well away from the worn Colt .45 that rested in his hip holster. "Name's Eli Boone. What's got you out here in this heat pulling that load like the devil himself is on your trail?" The boy's response was to back away another step, his frightened gaze darting between Eli and the empty trail behind him. Those eyes held a depth of anguish that no child should ever know, the kind that came from betrayal by those who should have provided protection and love. I ain't supposed to talk to strangers," the boy whispered, his voice cracked from thirst and terror. He'll hurt us both if he finds out." "Who will, son?" Eli asked gently, taking a single step closer. "Who's got you so scared?" Before the boy could answer, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. 2 riders approaching at full gallop, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard earth like approaching thunder. The child saw them and let out a sound that was half sob, half whimper, of pure panic. "They're coming," he gasped, his voice breaking completely. "They're coming for us, and they're gonna kill us both this time." Eli's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but he forced himself to focus on the boy instead. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice taking on the calm authority of a man who'd faced danger before. "I can see you're hurt and frightened. Let me help you." The boy's resolve cracked like a dam bursting under pressure. My name's Will Harper." He stammered the words, tumbling out in a desperate rush. "And she's in the sack. My little sister Lily. Uncle Jed, he made me drag her out here too." Will's voice shattered completely, dissolving into broken sobs. Ice water seemed to flood Eli's veins. Without hesitation, he drew his knife and sliced through the rope around Will's chest, then cut open the burlap sack with swift, efficient movements. What he found inside made his stomach lurch and his hands tremble with barely contained rage. A little girl no more than 5 years old lay unconscious in the suffocating darkness of the sack. Her tiny wrists were bound with coarse twine that had cut deep into her delicate skin, leaving angry red welts that spoke of prolonged restraint. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a struggle against the heat and confinement she'd endured. She was painfully thin, her clothes dirty, and torn, her face gaunt with the hollow-cheeked look of a child who hadn't eaten properly in far too long. Dear God in heaven. Eli breathed, gathering the girl into his arms with infinite care. Her skin burned with fever, and she felt light as a wounded bird in his grasp. The sight of her condition sent a familiar rage coursing through his veins, the same fury he'd felt standing over Sarah and Emma's graves, helpless to bring them back or find their killers. And what did he do to her? Eli demanded, his voice hard as granite. Uncle Jed said she was just dead weight. Will managed between sobs, tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. After Mama died of the fever 6 months back, he came and took over the farm. Said we were nothing but mouths to feed bodies, taking up space he could use better. He wanted to sell Mama's land, but the law said we had to be gone first. So the thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Eli could now make out the shapes of 2 men riding hard toward them. One carried a rifle across his saddle, the stock glinting in the harsh sunlight, while the other had his hand resting on the butt of a pistol. "He beat me regular." Will continued, his words coming faster as panic set in. "Trying to break my spirit, make me give up any claim to the land. And Lily, she was just a baby, so he figured nobody would miss her if she just disappeared. He said it was my punishment for talking back, for trying to protect her. Made me drag her out here myself, said it would teach me what happens to boys who don't mind their betters." Eli's vision went red around the edges. The little girl in his arms, Lily, stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness threatened to return. He could feel her rapid heartbeat against his chest, fragile as a hummingbird's wing. "We need to move," he said, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man pushed beyond his breaking point. "Now." He lifted Lily with infinite care, then hauled Will up behind him onto Dolly's back. The horse, a veteran of many dangerous situations, sensed the urgency and needed no encouragement to break into a gallop toward a cluster of large boulders roughly 100 yards to their left. There they are. The shout echoed across the desert, filled with rage and determination. "Don't let them reach town." The crack of a rifle split the air, and a bullet whined past Eli's ear, close enough that he felt the displaced air. He leaned low over Dolly's neck, shielding the children with his body as best he could, while urging the horse to greater speed. Another shot rang out closer this time, sending rock chips flying from a boulder just ahead of them. The horse's muscles bunched and stretched as she gave everything she had, her hooves pounding against the hardpan in a rhythm that matched Eli's racing heartbeat. They reached the relative safety of the rocks just as a third bullet sparked off the stone where Eli's head had been moments before. He slid from the saddle with practiced efficiency, passing Lily to Will, before grabbing his Winchester from its scabbard. The children huddled together behind the largest boulder, while Eli found a firing position that gave him a clear view of their pursuers. The two men had spread out, using the sparse cover of desert scrub and smaller rocks to approach from different angles. The older one, a heavy-set man with a graying beard and cruel eyes, was shouting orders to his companion, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Circle around," left Burke. "We got them pinned down good." Eli lined up his sights on the man's chest and squeezed the trigger. The shot went deliberately wide. He wanted to keep them at bay, not start an all-out war he might not be able to finish. But the message was clear. Both men dove for cover, and their advance stopped temporarily. "I will," Eli called softly, not taking his eyes off the desert. "Tell me about this uncle of yours. Every detail you can remember." "Uncle Jed Harlan." Will replied, his voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. He's Mama's brother, but he never came around when she was alive. Hated Papa, said he wasn't good enough for the family. But soon as Mama died, he showed up with papers claiming the farm was his by right of inheritance. Started spreading lies about us all over town, saying I was a thief who'd steal anything not nailed down, and that Lily wasn't even Papa's real daughter. He told anyone who'd listen that we were just bastard children with no claim to anything. Eli's jaw clenched as the picture became clearer. Smart man, your uncle. Poison the well before anyone can drink from it. And the other man, I don't know his name for sure, but he wears a badge. Uncle Jed said he had the law on his side, that nobody would believe the word of two orphan brats over a sheriff and a respectable landowner. The words hit Eli like a physical blow. A corrupt lawman was dangerous enough under normal circumstances, but one who'd stand by while a man tortured children was something else entirely. He'd encountered such men during his years of wandering bullies who used their badge to line their pockets and settle personal scores. "Then listen to me, Will," Eli said, checking his ammunition with practiced hands. "You see that dry creek bed about 50 yards behind us? If things go bad, you take Lily and follow it north. It'll lead you to an old mining claim I know about. There's a tunnel there where you can hide until help comes. What about you, Mr. Boone?" "I'll be along directly." Eli hoped he was telling the truth. The standoff stretched into the afternoon, with occasional exchanges of gunfire, keeping both sides pinned down. Eli rationed his water carefully, giving most of it to Lily, who had begun to stir and whimper softly in Will's arms. The little girl's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and filled with confusion before closing again. "She needs a doctor," Will said desperately, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know, son. We'll get her to one." But even as he spoke, Eli wondered how. The two men had them effectively trapped, and with a corrupt sheriff involved riding into Bitter Creek, might be walking straight into a hangman's noose. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red, Eli caught a glimpse of movement from the attacker's position. The man with the badge was working his way around to the right, trying to get a clear shot at their position. Eli adjusted his own position, bringing his rifle to bear on the new threat. That's when he saw it clearly for the first time, a glint of sunlight off polished metal. And not just any metal. A sheriff's star worn on the chest of a man who crouched behind a dead mesquite tree with a rifle in his hands. There was something familiar about the way the man moved, something that tickled the edges of Eli's memory. "Burke," the older man, Jed, shouted across the desert. "You got a clear shot at the bastard yet?" "Working on it, brother," came the reply, and Eli's world tilted on its axis. Brother. The pieces began clicking together in his mind, like the chambers of a well-oiled revolver. Burke wasn't just any corrupt sheriff. He was Sheriff Burke Harlan Jed's brother, and they were working together to steal a dead woman's land and eliminate the only witnesses to their crime. "Will," Eli said quietly, never taking his eyes off the desert. "This Sheriff Burke, have you ever seen him before today?" "Once or twice. When Mrs. Thorne tried to visit us after Mama died to check on how we were doing, Uncle Jed said Sheriff Burke told her to mind her own business. Said family matters weren't for outsiders to interfere with and that she'd be arrested for trespassing if she came around again." "Mrs. Thorne." "Clara Thorne. She was Mama's best friend since they were girls. She tried to help us, brought food and medicine when she could, but Uncle Jed, he said the sheriff would lock her up if she kept meddling." Will's voice cracked with remembered pain. "She was the only one who cared about us, and they scared her away." Eli felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest. These men hadn't just terrorized two innocent children, they'd systematically isolated them from anyone who might have helped. It was a pattern he'd seen before in other towns, other tragedies. The powerful preying on the weak, using fear and corruption to silence anyone who might speak up for justice. But there was something else, something that nagged at the edges of his memory. The way Burke moved, the timbre of his voice, the casual cruelty in his tone, it all seemed hauntingly familiar. "Return my property, Boone." Jed's voice echoed off the rocks, filled with arrogant confidence. "That boy's a thieving little bastard, and the girl's nothing but dead weight. Hand them over, and maybe you can ride away from this. And if I don't—" Eli called back, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll join them in the ground, same as anyone else who gets in our way." A rifle cracked and stone chips exploded inches from Eli's head. He ducked lower, his mind racing through possibilities. 2 against 1 with at least one of them, a skilled marksman. The children were weak and terrified, with little Lily barely conscious. Even if they somehow made it to town, a corrupt sheriff could spin any story he wanted, paint Eli as the villain, and the children as victims of some tragic misunderstanding. The distant sound of wheels and hoofbeats drifted across the desert, a stagecoach by the rhythm of it, probably carrying mail between the scattered settlements. Eli rose up and waved his hat, desperate to signal for help. "Hey, over here, help us." But the distant crack of gunfire had already spooked the driver. The coach picked up speed, its passengers no doubt urging the driver to avoid whatever trouble was brewing among the rocks. Within minutes, it was gone, leaving only a cloud of dust and the echo of Eli's hopes disappearing into the vastness. "Looks like you're on your own, Boone." Burke called out, his voice carrying the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Just like you were in Dawson Creek." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, sending ice water through his veins. Dawson Creek, the town where his family had died, the raid that had destroyed his world. And suddenly, with terrible clarity, he remembered where he'd seen Burke before. And that's right. Burke continued, his voice closer now as he worked his way around the rocks. "I remember you, Boone. Remember your pretty little wife and that blonde-haired daughter of yours. Shame about what happened to them, but sometimes innocent folks get caught in the crossfire." "You bastard." Eli whispered, his hands shaking with rage and recognition. "You were there. You were part of it." "Part of it?" Burke laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "Friend, I planned the whole damn thing. Needed a distraction while I cleaned out the bank's safe deposit boxes, and what better way than a good old-fashioned robbery? Your family just had the bad luck to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." The world went silent around Eli, as if all sound had been sucked from the desert. The man who had murdered his wife and daughter was here now, threatening to kill 2 more innocent children. The circle was closing, and fate was offering him a chance at the justice he'd been denied for 3 long years. "You see, Boone," Burke continued, apparently enjoying the revelation, "I've been using this badge to cover my tracks for years. Rob a bank, kill a few witnesses, then investigate my own crimes. Works like a charm. And now I need the money from this land sale to disappear for good, start fresh somewhere new. Can't have loose ends like you and these brats messing that up. The sun was setting now, painting the landscape in deep purples and blacks. The desert night would be cold, and Lily's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her breathing had become more labored, and she shivered despite the lingering heat from the day. We can't stay here. Eli muttered more to himself than to Will. That little girl needs help, and she needs it soon. He thought of the old mining tunnel he'd discovered during his brief stint as a prospector several months back. It was maybe half a mile north, hidden in a fold of the hills that surrounded Bitter Creek. The mine had played out years ago, but the tunnel was still structurally sound, and it had a back entrance that opened onto the hillside above town. Now, Will, listen to me. Eli said, his voice taking on the tone of a man who'd made his final decision. When I give the word, you pick up your sister and run for that creek bed. Follow it north until you see a hill with a big white boulder at the top. The mine entrance is at the base of that hill. What about you? I'll be right behind you. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Will nodded anyway, gathering Lily into his arms with the careful tenderness of a boy who'd been forced to grow up far too quickly. Eli took a deep breath, thought of Sarah and Emma waiting for him in whatever came after this life, and opened fire. His first shot took Burke in the shoulder, spinning the corrupt sheriff around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocks. The man's scream of pain and rage echoed across the desert, but Eli was already moving, levering another round into the chamber. His second shot shattered the stock of Jed's weapon, leaving the man armed with nothing but a sidearm at long range. The older man dove for cover, cursing viciously as splinters of wood peppered his face. "Go!" Eli shouted, and Will ran. The boy was faster than Eli had expected, driven by desperation and love for his sister. He reached the creek bed just as Burke, despite his wounded shoulder, managed to draw his pistol with his good hand and return fire. The bullet caught Eli in the thigh, a burning line of agony that sent him stumbling against the rocks. He felt warm blood soaking through his pants, but he gritted his teeth and kept shooting, laying down covering fire as Will disappeared into the shadows of the wash. "You killed my family." Eli roared, his voice carrying all the pain and fury of 3 years of grief. "You murdered my wife and daughter. And now I'm going to kill you and those brats." Burke snarled back, advancing despite his wound. "Should have minded your own business, Boone." But Jed had retrieved a backup weapon from somewhere, and his next shot was close enough to spray Eli's face with rock dust. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Eli knew he had to move or die. Gritting his teeth against the pain in his leg, he grabbed what remained of his ammunition and limped after Will, following the boy's path into the creek bed. Behind him, he could hear the two men shouting their voices, growing more distant with each painful step. The dry wash was treacherous in the growing darkness, full of loose stones and hidden obstacles. More than once Eli stumbled and nearly fell, his wounded leg threatening to give out beneath him. But he kept moving, driven by the knowledge that 2 innocent children were depending on him. He found Will huddled against the creek bank, Lily limp in his arms. The little girl's breathing was so shallow it was barely visible, and her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that spoke of imminent collapse. "She's dying," Will whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I can feel it. She's dying, and it's all my fault for not being strong enough to protect her." "No," Eli said firmly, taking the girl into his arms, despite the agony in his leg. "This isn't your fault, son. None of it is. You're the bravest boy I've ever met, and your sister's lucky to have you." He could see the mine entrance now, a dark opening in the hillside that promised shelter, if not safety. But as they approached, Eli's heart sank. The opening was partially blocked by a recent rockfall, leaving only a narrow gap that would be difficult to squeeze through. "Can we fit?" Will asked, his voice small and frightened. "We'll make it fit. The sound of pursuit was growing closer, boots scraping on stone, harsh breathing. The occasional curse as one of the men stumbled in the darkness. Eli pushed Will through the gap first, then carefully passed Lily through before squeezing his own larger frame into the tunnel. The rough stone tore at his clothes and scraped his skin, but he made it through just as the first shots began echoing off the tunnel walls. The mine was black as pitch, with only the faintest hint of starlight filtering through the entrance. Eli felt around in the darkness until his fingers found what he was looking for. An old mining cart left behind when the claim had played out. And in the cart, wrapped in oiled canvas, were several sticks of dynamite and a coil of fuse. "Now get as far back as you can," Eli told Will, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done 3 years ago." Eli replied, thinking of his wife and daughter and of the man who'd stolen them from him. "I'm going to finish this." He could hear Jed and Burke at the entrance, now their voices echoing off the stone walls as they forced their way through the narrow gap. Eli struck a match, the tiny flame bright as a star in the absolute darkness of the tunnel. "I know you're in there, Boone." Jed's voice boomed through the cavern. "There's nowhere left to run." "You're right," Eli said, touching the match to the fuse. The cord sparked to life, hissing and spitting as it burned toward the dynamite. "There isn't." Burke's voice cut through the darkness, filled with vicious satisfaction. "When we're done with you, we're going to make those kids suffer for every bit of trouble they've caused us." But Eli was already moving, grabbing Will and Lily and running deeper into the mine. The tunnel curved away from the entrance, following the old ore vein that had once made this claim profitable. Behind them, the fuse continued its deadly countdown. The explosion, when it came, was like the voice of God, speaking in thunder. The entire mountain seemed to shake on its foundations, and chunks of rock rained down from the ceiling. Eli threw himself over the children, shielding them with his body, as debris crashed around them. The screams from the entrance were brief and terrible, cut off by the rumble of tons of falling stone. Then silence broken only by the settling of dust and the whisper of small rocks still finding their way to the tunnel floor. "Are we trapped?" Will asked, his voice small and frightened in the darkness. Eli struck another match, revealing a tunnel that stretched on into the mountain's depths. "No, son. I know another way out. But it's going to be a long, hard climb." The ventilation shaft was narrow and steep, carved into the living rock by miners who had needed fresh air in the depths of the earth. Eli went first, his wounded legs screaming with every step, while Will followed close behind, with Lily cradled against his chest. They climbed for what felt like hours, their hands raw and bleeding from the rough stone. The shaft was treacherous, with loose rocks that gave way without warning, sending them sliding back down precious yards they'd already gained. More than once, Eli's wounded leg nearly gave out completely, but each time he forced himself to continue, driven by the knowledge that 2 innocent lives depended on his strength. When they finally emerged into the cold desert night, Eli's legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the hillside, gasping for breath, his whole body shaking with exhaustion and pain. Will fell beside him, still clutching Lily, both children covered in dust and grime, but alive. Below them, the lights of Bitter Creek twinkled like fallen stars in the valley. The town was just beginning to stir, with the first hints of dawn smoke rising from chimneys as early risers prepared for another day. "We made it," Will whispered, hardly daring to believe it was true. "Yeah," Eli replied, feeling Lily's faint but steady heartbeat against his chest. "We made it." They stumbled into town just as the sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Eli's clothes were torn and bloody, his face blackened with soot and dust. Will looked like a scarecrow, his hair matted with grime and his eyes hollow with exhaustion. And Lily hung limp in his arms, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. The first person they encountered was Dr. Samuel Morrison, an elderly man who'd been tending the sick and injured in Bitter Creek for over 30 years. He took one look at the children and ushered them into his office without a word of question. "What happened here?" he asked, his experienced hands already moving over Lily's still form, checking her pulse and breathing with professional efficiency. "Not child abuse," Eli said simply, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "Their uncle was trying to kill them for their inheritance. Had help from a corrupt sheriff." Word spread through the small town like wildfire. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered outside the doctor's office, their faces grim with anger and disbelief. These were hard people forged by the unforgiving frontier, but they had children of their own, and the sight of Will's bruises and Lily's condition stirred something primal in their hearts. "Where's Sheriff Burke?" someone called out. "He needs to arrest that bastard Harlan. Burke's dead," Eli said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Killed in a mine collapse along with Jed Harlan. But it wasn't any accident. They were trying to murder these children, and they nearly succeeded." The crowd erupted in angry shouts and demands for answers. But before the situation could spiral out of control, a new voice cut through the noise. "Let me through, please let me through." Clara Thorne pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her face pale with shock and desperate hope. She was a woman in her 40s, with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much sorrow in her lifetime. Will Harper, is that really you?" She dropped to her knees beside the boy, her hands hovering over his bruised face, as if afraid to touch him. "Oh, sweetheart, what did that monster do to you?" "Mrs. Thorne." Will's voice was barely a whisper, cracked with emotion. You came back. I tried to help before," she said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "But those monsters, they threatened me. Said I'd be arrested if I kept interfering in family business. I should have been braver. Should have fought harder for you and your sister. You're here now," Eli said gently, understanding passing between them. "That's what matters." Dr. Morrison emerged from his office, his expression grave, but not hopeless. "The little girl is alive, but barely. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and evidence of repeated physical trauma. She's going to need weeks of careful nursing, maybe months of recovery. But she'll have it," Clara said with fierce determination. "Both of them will. I should have taken them in when their mother died, but I let those devils scare me away. I won't make that mistake again." A circuit judge arrived from the territorial capital 5 days later, summoned by the townspeople who demanded a full investigation into the deaths and the children's condition. Eli told his story in careful detail, backed up by Will's testimony and the physical evidence that Dr. Morrison had meticulously documented. The judge ordered the collapsed mine to be excavated, a process that took nearly a week of careful digging. When the bodies of Jed Harlan and Burke Harlan were finally recovered, the evidence was overwhelming. The remains of dynamite and fuse were found near the bodies, along with weapons and personal effects that corroborated Eli's account. But the most damning evidence came from Burke's own belongings. Hidden in his saddlebags were documents proving his involvement in the Dawson Creek robbery, including a detailed plan of the bank and a list of safety deposit box holders. There were also letters between the brothers outlining their scheme to claim the Harper children's inheritance through intimidation and murder. The judge's verdict was swift and decisive. Jed Harlan had been guilty of child abuse, attempted murder, and inheritance fraud. Sheriff Burke Harlan had been guilty of multiple murders, robbery, corruption, and conspiracy. Their deaths, while violent, were the direct result of their own criminal actions. Clara Thorne wasted no time in filing papers to formally adopt Will and Lily, a process made easier by the overwhelming support of the community. The children's mother's farm was returned to them, held in trust, until they came of age, with Clara appointed as their guardian and the estate's administrator. Lily's recovery was slow and painful. her small body healing faster than her traumatized spirit. She would wake screaming from nightmares, remembering the suffocating darkness of the burlap sack and the terror of not knowing if she would ever see daylight again. But with Clara's patient care and Will's constant presence, she gradually began to smile again, to laugh, to play, like the child she was meant to be. The bad men are gone, she would whisper to her rag doll during the quiet moments. Will and Mr. Boone made them go away forever. Will carried scars that would never fully heal, but he found purpose in his sister's recovery and in helping other children who found themselves in desperate situations. He worked with Clara to establish a network of trusted families throughout the territory, people willing to take in orphaned or abused children. It was his way of ensuring that no child would ever again suffer in the kind of silence that had nearly destroyed him and Lily. And Eli found something he hadn't expected after 3 years of aimless wandering peace. Not the peace of a celebrated hero, but the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally found his purpose. When the townspeople offered him the position of sheriff, he accepted, knowing that he could use his experience and his pain to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. He never married again, never had children of his own, but he became a guardian to every child in Bitter Creek. They would come to him with their problems, their fears, their secrets, knowing that he would listen and act when action was needed. He was the man who had proven that sometimes all it took was one person willing to stop and ask the right questions. Years later, when people asked Will Harper what he remembered most about that terrible day in the desert, he would always give the same answer. A stranger saw something wrong and chose to help instead of looking the other way. That one choice changed everything, not just for me and Lily, but for every child who came after us. The burlap sack that had held Lily was burned in a ceremony attended by the entire town, its destruction marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The smoke rose high into the desert sky, carrying with it the last physical remnant of a nightmare that had been conquered by courage, compassion, and the simple decision to do what was right. In the end, that's what mattered most. Not the darkness they had faced, but the light they had chosen to kindle in response. It was a light that would continue to burn long after the last witness to their story had passed away. A beacon of hope for anyone who found themselves dragging their own burden through the dust, looking for someone brave enough to ask what was inside and strong enough to help them carry it to safety.